welcome everyone to this ClinicalTrials.gov presentation. My name is Donna O'Neill, and I'm the Director of the Office for Clinical Research Advancement. Our office is co-sponsoring this event with the Office of Research Development, and I'd especially like to thank Evangeline and Rachel from ORD for all their efforts in making this workshop possible. This event is being recorded so that we can share the discussion as well as the slides after the presentation. We had quite a number of registrants who couldn't make the meeting at this time, so they'll get the presentation later along with everyone joining us today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to use the chat feature to pose any questions you may have. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters to introduce themselves and tell you how to navigate ClinicalTrials.gov.
Hi everyone, my name is Chrissy Capitano, and I am the Clinical Research Navigator in the Office for Clinical Research Advancement, where I help researchers at FSU. I assist them with their clinical research and clinical trials. In addition to this service, I am also the ClinicalTrials.gov administrator, where I help create accounts and manage records for researchers. And before coming to FSU, I was the head clinical research nurse for the University of Georgia, where I was first introduced to ClinicalTrials.gov from a user's perspective. So after overcoming some struggles on the site and working with FSU researchers who are experiencing similar problems, I reached out to Michael Ormsby to add some reality to the presentation and give some feedback from a user's perspective while I approach it from an administrative standpoint. So hopefully this presentation will help you better navigate this site. And I'll turn it over to Michael.
All right, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm actually surprised that I was the one brought onto this call because I've actually expressed my frustrations over this site a number of times over the years, and it turns out they want that perspective. And so what my job is today is just to provide some comments on the process, the way that I've navigated that in my lab and in my career, and hopefully provide some real examples for how to best sort of get into the system, enter data, and why or why not we should even be using this thing. I've been here for a decade at FSU. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Nutrition, Food, and Exercise Sciences. So many of my examples come from an exercise or supplement use or nutritional strategy perspective. And I also am the associate director of the Institute of Sports Sciences and Medicine. So we have other examples of researchers in our facility that are using this system. So that's why I'm here, and hopefully we can provide some good info today.
So the learning objectives for this presentation is you hopefully walk away understanding how to create a new account on clinicaltrials.gov if you don't already have an account, and also kind of be able to determine what types of clinical trials need to register on the site and what federal regulations guide those requirements, and also become a little bit more familiarized with the quality control review process from the other side, from clinicaltrials.gov, and then also be able to identify study registration timelines and deadlines, and know where resources for clinicaltrials.gov are at FSU and online. To kind of give you a brief background on clinicaltrials.gov, before this site existed, there was no way for researchers to really report serious adverse events and adverse events in clinical trials to kind of relay that information. A good example is Vioxx, which was a really big breakthrough drug for rheumatoid arthritis treatment because it provided the least amount of side effects for anti-inflammatory drugs than any other anti-inflammatory drug. Only problem with this drug is it caused increased heart attacks and stroke risk in certain populations. And although it was relayed to the FDA, this data, it wasn't available to patients, healthcare providers, or individual researchers. And as a result, there was patient deaths and there was wasted research money. So although Vioxx is not the reason why this site was created, it's a good example of why it was created, to kind of relay this information to prescribers, patients, and also researchers themselves. So what studies must be registered? If your clinical trial meets certain criteria, it must register on ClinicalTrials.gov. And Michael, did you have any tips or how you determine how your studies, if they should be posted online or not?
Sure. This actually has evolved over the years in my experience with this particular registration site. Initially, it was a little more haphazard. We just simply, when we remembered to do it, we would do it. And that has evolved now because of the definitions, which I know we'll get into here, of what a clinical trial is, have been defined better and outlined better by the major funding organizations. And so now we basically treat everything that it has to be registered. And I think that your slides coming up will really point to why that is in a human trial. There's many reasons why we should probably be doing this practice.
If you are funded by the NIH and you meet this definition of a clinical trial, you must register. So if you have one or more subjects in a trial with one or more interventions, which includes placebo and control, and you're looking to evaluate the effects of those interventions related to biomedical or behavioral outcomes, you qualify and you should register. It doesn't matter if it's a phase 1 clinical trial. It doesn't matter on the type of intervention. Another requirement recently updated by the NIH, if you are funded by the NIH clinical trial, you're required to post one IRB approved informed consent, and this should be done no later than 60 days after the last study visit is conducted. The Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act of 2007 and the Final Rule require that all applicable clinical trials register to ClinicalTrials.gov. And this definition differs from the NIH a little bit. The NIH is more broad. This is more specific. You have to meet certain criteria listed here, but there's some exclusions to this criteria. Is phase 1 drug trials, small clinical trials testing feasibility or prototypes testing, and also if it does not include a biologic, a device, or drugs, that's an exclusion as well, and non-interventional clinical trials are excluded. This slide here shows the checklist in a little bit more elaborate detail. It kind of gives you some information. And if you can answer yes to all 4 of these questions, you have an applicable clinical trial and will need to register. This document here is not the whole document. There's several other pages which list possible exceptions to the rule. And I've listed the website here. If you find this helpful, you can use it. I often use it when I'm helping researchers as well. So the final way to look at your clinical trial, if you should register or not, is taking into consideration the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and they require clinical trials, including phase 1 ACTs, to register if they want to publish. So it's a consideration of publication. And they also require that you share a data sharing statement as well on this site. So here, Michael, do you have anything to add or include in this part right here?
Yeah, I think it's important for everybody to realize that while there's all these definitions that you may or not have heard and registered that Chrissy just went through, basically it all applies. And in a human trials research scenario, there's always a reason to put your data into the system for ClinicalTrials.gov. The backside of this is the publishing requirements. And some people just don't know that the journal they're going to go to in the beginning, and they don't spend time investigating that because it's usually later down the pipeline for a research agenda. However, in my experience, the quality journals are requiring to be registered with ClinicalTrials.gov, and they'll specifically ask for your registration number. And so more and more, they're requiring this to be part of the process. And I think it's just a layer of protection for the journal, as well as the data quality and those types of issues that might come up. But certainly in a publishing scenario, the medical journals, the high quality medical journals are requiring this number to be included in your manuscript preparation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to add as well that you may meet the NIH definition of a clinical trial but not be funded. But so that's when you look at the publication considerations. If you meet the definitions but aren't necessarily funded by those sources, it's just a safe bet to say go ahead and register your study. Okay, diving into details. Sorry, I had to include some scuba diving reference. It's my favorite sport. So you've made it this far and you've determined that you need to register your study. Well, for those who do not have an account, you will contact me at Okra and I will be more than happy to create an account for you. And once this process is complete, I'll just add your name and your email address, and then you'll be prompted to finish registration by ClinicalTrials.gov. They'll send an automated email. While you're finishing registration, it's important to note that the organization for Florida State University is Florida State U, and this is case sensitive, and it should be spelled exactly how you see it here. And once you've completed registration, there's a quick user guide that's helpful in broad topics, but it doesn't really dive into the details of navigating this site, and we'll get into some resources later that are available for that. But for those researchers that already have a new study, already have an account and just would like to create a new study record, it's important to remember that FSU's policy for clinical trial registration and reporting system, reporting and training delegates that the principal investigator is the responsible party at FSU. So unless it's industry, which you would probably not be entering this information anyways, but the sponsor is Florida State University and the responsible party is the principal investigator. And then in collaboration with the Office for Human Subjects Protection, to increase capabilities for assistance and just kind of streamline processes, we're asking that researchers put their FSU RAMP IRB study ID as their unique protocol ID. And this just kind of helps with a lot of different processes on ClinicalTrials.gov and off. So important times and registration deadlines to go over. Study registration, the record, it must be submitted on ClinicalTrials.gov within 21 days of enrolling your first participant. And then the study start date, although you can put anticipated, it needs to be updated within 30 calendar days of the first subject being enrolled. And then primary completion study date is when the final study participant is examined and receives an intervention for the purposes of collecting data. So this is just primary data collection. And then the study completion date is actually when there is no more data being collected anywhere on the project. So this may include secondary data that you may have still been collecting. And if there is no secondary data being collected, the primary completion date and the study completion date are the same timelines. And then record verification date, this is important. So as long as your clinical trial is active, you are required to update this every 12 months. And a helpful tip may just be to remember when you're doing a continuing review with the IRB, just to check into ClinicalTrials.gov and make sure everything's still up to date. And it's important to note here that this is not an all-inclusive list. There's a lot more deadlines, but I just chose the most applicable to what I've seen at FSU. It's important to note since recent times that things have changed and our approaches to research has changed, that COVID-19 has created kind of chaos everywhere. And it's important to note that if you submitted a modification to the IRB and exemptions and you were approved, it's important to remember that you need to update your ClinicalTrials.gov record as well. So any modifications that were done by the IRB needs to be reflected in your record on ClinicalTrials.gov. And you have 30 days to do this after this change in status.
Chrissy, let me add that I think that it's so hard to stick to these timelines. You know, as a researcher, you might line up the best plan, but it always gets changed for one reason or another. And the last thing you think about is actually updating ClinicalTrials.gov. There's many other things that seem like they're a bigger priority, like IRB changes, for example, would be number one, informing subjects or patients, however your lab is running. And so it is an afterthought to think about updating and modifying ClinicalTrials.gov. 9 times out of 10, I forget about it, and I get an email about a notification from the system, which I know we'll get into here with some examples. But I think Chrissy's right in that if we could have it part of the RAMP system where we get the alerts to update our RAMP protocols, it would be a great time to also update ClinicalTrials.gov. It's not easy, but it is something that's going to be required because there are penalties if you don't do it.
I think it's important to kind of look how we can sync these processes together, because it is a lot of work and detail and deadlines to remember. But I'm always here and happy to help, because it is complicated sometimes. Well, let's just say you didn't register your clinical trial, or there's major issues. There are penalties for not being compliant. So there is a possibility for up to $10,000 fine to the responsible party. And it's important to note here as a responsible party, because at FSU, that's the principal investigator. In addition, there could be up to $10,000 per fine. I'm not quite sure how this is handled and the fines are collected, but I just know that that's what they are posting. But I do know that there's potential loss for funding for future research with the principal investigator and ultimately the university as well. So it has a trickle-down effect to grow into a really large issue, not just for the researcher, but for the university as well. So this slide here kind of gives an overview process of what it looks like at Florida State University when you submit a record. So you're going to create a record, and then it'll notify me to review the record for details, make sure there's not any edits that need to go in. And then if everything looks great, I'll let you know it's good, and then you can submit it to ct.gov. And then from this part is kind of where the party begins. Not really party, but you either go through 2 different processes. You have a record passes, everything looks good, it's gone through the quality control checks, and it will be released to public. And so it's posted on the public website and everybody can see your record. And if it does not, and it needs some further edits, is then when the PRS is going to email you and let you know that you have some issues that you need to look at, some things you need to change, and then you'll go through, the process will kind of start itself over. When you're done doing the edits and updates, it'll alert me to look at the record, I'll review it again, and then it'll be re-released. And this may happen several times, but we will get through this together. And Mike, do you have any comments on this part? Because I know that we've become kind of familiar with this.
Yeah, that left pathway doesn't exist. It's always going to go right. You'll have multiple rounds of this. And a lot of it's because the language is so different between disciplines. They're trying to structure it to be language that's used across the board, and it gets confusing because of that. And I think that flags many of the errors that you're going to see in the examples, the specific examples coming next. But just be ready for it. It's going to be recycled and reviewed. Luckily, we have Chrissy now to help with this, to try to get these right. We have someone who can help a little bit, but I feel like we should be ready for the right side of this to revise and resubmit. But again, with the details coming, it should help a lot on the front side for entering the data properly.
So this is an example of a message that you may receive if there needs to be edits. So if you receive an issue, major issue message, there's definitely needs to be corrections within your record, and they will highlight what is wrong with your records right here. This example is primary outcome measure. The time frame, it doesn't seem to be in a specific format or the correct format. This part can get tricky interpreting exactly what they're looking for. So hopefully these examples I'm about to show you kind of breaks it down a little bit better for you. And advisory messages, they're generally attached to the major issue messages. These are just aimed to improve clarity. They try to provide some details of what they're looking for in the edit. They are not necessarily any issue message, and it kind of goes in with warning messages too. Some of it applies and some of it doesn't. These messages you can ignore, but the major issue messages you can't. And Good old Homer Simpson. I love this slide because sometimes when you log on and you're trying to enter in all this information and navigate this site, you kind of feel like he does right here. Where do I start? And it feels kind of overwhelming, but I found breaking it down into sections helps. But Michael, I think you can add some commentary here because there's a lot of detail from feedback from FSU researchers in a survey and on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I think this is so true. And some of the comments that, I reached out and tried to get information from other researchers, and everybody feels this way. It's like you don't know where to start, you don't know what to enter, it's not intuitive. And so it's really a challenge with how to set this up. And this is just on the front side for explaining what you're going to do, which you already know you're going to do, and it's still hard to enter that properly. There's differences in terminology that I've already mentioned between arms and interventions, and it gets a little bit repetitive. And so, we're used to writing in a way that streamlines and is very efficient in how we write and up our data. However, the process in CT.gov is the opposite. It's really expanding upon everything, repeating every section over and over so that all the arms interventions are clear to the CT.gov side of this. And that just creates a lot of confusion. The quotes from some of the researchers in this area were basically that it's clunky, hard to navigate, and the terminology is a problem. And I think that the specific details that Chrissy will share next will show what's wrong and then how to fix that, and that'll be a big help to those listening on this call. This was a crowdsourcing effort. Actually went to Twitter to do this and just put out a general comment, like what are people's thoughts on this particular system. And these are some of the comments, the real comments that came back, and these are all researchers in human physiology and nutrition. And you can see them there. Mark me down as an agreement. Feels like I need to take a computer programming course just to get through the complete submission. And everybody sort of agreed. Details with it being not intuitive, where to enter things, technical issues become a problem. And then you see the last comment there. It's almost a guessing game of what they want. Outcome variables, population, time period. Not only is the terminology confusing, but it's also last on your list because you're probably most interested in the grant agency and supporting your write-ups to them, as well as your manuscript preparation and publications. And so this becomes a last item on your to-do list, and it is challenging when you just want it to be off your plate.
So the NIH recognizes that there's some issues that are common among the records that they see, and they listed them as unclear outcome measures in the protocol, vague timeframes in the outcome measurements, multiple timeframes in one measurement, and missing information in the arms intervention part of the study record. So I started with this, the outcome measures, not because it's the first blank you're going to fill in your record, but looking at it more kind of in a nursing perspective. I looked at the outcome measures as your overall measurement, the reason kind of why you're doing the clinical trial. And then the arms and interventions are how are you going to get to those outcome measurements. So I started here just to kind of say that the outcome measurement is described in the protocol to determine the effect is your outcome. And there could be primary and secondary outcome measurements included in your record. And with observational studies, I included this here because we do have some of those studies. And it's used like whatever you use to describe patterns of disease, traits, or association with exposures, risk factors, or treatments. But overall, your outcome measurement should include a time frame, the number of participants that you analyze, the measure type, and the measure of dispersion and unit of measure. So like I just said, the main outcome measurement, the primary, is the reason why you are evaluating, why you're doing the clinical trial. So you're evaluating the effect of the intervention and treatment. And there can be more than one primary outcome measure, but as we'll see in the next slide, it gets kind of complex when you try to do things like that. So here you can see at the very top, that outcome measure. It looks like a drug trial. They were looking to report the number of participants with serious adverse events, and where they went wrong was the time frame. They lumped the 3-month, the 6-month, and the 12-month measurement into one area, when in fact the primary outcome was the 3-month, and they should have listed the secondary outcome measures as the 6-month and the 12-month. And so the overall lesson here is just to make sure you're separating out your time frame measurements if you have multiple time measurements that you're going to use with your primary outcome measurement. So secondary outcome measurements, like I just spoke about, are to collect additional data. And a good example would be if you were doing an exercise clinical trial to see how the intervention improved blood flow, say the lower extremities. You would probably still want to collect blood pressure, heart rate, other effects of this intervention. So those would be more secondary outcome measures. They wanted to collect vital signs, which included pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, temperature, and pain. And they just needed to list this out in separate different secondary measure outcomes and list them out individually and not lump them into one section. I included this slide because here it shows the pain scale, which I think could be helpful if you're not collecting, if you're collecting data more or less in, not in a quantitative, but more pain scale like mild, moderate, severe, these things. That's how they want you to list them out. And sometimes it looks like a lot of explaining, but we also have to keep in mind that the public is going to be looking at this record and details of it and have to comprehend it. So the more you can elaborate, do not use any scientific or medical jargon, acronyms, just spell everything out. That helps the most, I would say, is a common issue I see is use of acronyms and medical jargon. Other major issues commonly seen are in the arms intervention part of the study record. And so this is a subgroup of participants in the clinical trial that receives a specific treatment. So it could be an experimental arm, placebo comparator, active comparator, sham comparator, or no intervention. And in this section, a lot of records just have unclear interventions or arms, or they're missing one part of the whole complete section of the record. And here's an example of a dietary supplement clinical trial where they are going to be using the active comparator, which is the mineral-rich algae drink, and then they're going to be there's going to be a washout period, and then the placebo is going to be given in the form of just an orange drink. And while this information is correct, and there's nothing wrong with the information here, it's the way that it was put into the section. So the active comparator needs to be separated out from the placebo, which is the placebo comparator. And as you can see here, the information was great. They just needed to separate it out, the active comparator, and give the intervention treatment, and then the placebo comparator, and then the intervention and treatment with the placebo.
I think on these two, it's really important to just see the nuances and how the language is a little bit different. So I would be used to seeing treatment as the placebo or the supplement, and this is where it's the arm is the treatment or the supplement, and the intervention and treatment in CT.gov is what it actually is. What is the drink actually made of? So I feel like the terminology in these examples will be really useful to going back for others to try to enter things properly and repetitively like this.
Okay, so you've entered everything into the system and you've actually made it. Your record is going public. You will probably receive, you will receive an email, and thank you, Michael, for an example of when your record gets posted to public and you feel like celebrating, and you should, but you're not quite done yet with ClinicalTrials.gov. So when your clinical trial is done, you say, okay, well, what's next? Well, you're going to have to report your results on ClinicalTrials.gov. And the FDA 801, it mandates that submission of results for certain trials that qualify for biologics, drugs, and devices, and they're required to report these results even if they're not published. And what they're looking for is participant flow, baseline characteristics, outcome measures and statistical analysis, and adverse events. They want those data elements to be reported on this site. Mike, I think you had something here to add about the data and kind of trouble navigating what's expected and where to look for that information on there.
Yeah, I feel like ClinicalTrials.gov kind of comes on my mind at the beginning more so than at the end. And you gave the timeline for when we need to enter data, like the results of the data into the system. And sometimes that doesn't match how it actually works in human trials, where we'll collect data, then we'll have a massive amount of biological samples stored in a freezer, which take more months to analyze. And so the timeline can be weird here in terms of when you enter data, remembering to enter data, any modifications that occurred along the way that you made to your IRB, but you didn't make to ct.gov. And so all of a sudden you're thinking, what did I enter before and what has to be entered now? But it's an important step because I have actually seen a case where a particular study was published and then a different researcher at a different university went back to the ct.gov registry and found some nuanced differences between the published manuscript and what was put into ct.gov. And that was really the biggest problem that they had, is that they then had to defend not updating ct.gov, or were they making up data? Was there a flaw? Was there anything malicious going on? And it's because the records didn't match, and you could get yourself in some big trouble if you don't keep it up to date as you move along, and then enter those data back into the system.
There is some help on ClinicalTrials.gov for this. They provide a checklist of what they're looking for, and also there are templates that you could use to help you fill in the details, and kind of explains a little bit what they're looking for exactly in these areas when you're inputting this data. So you're ready to put the data in to your study record. You'll need to log back in and find your study that you need to enter the results in. And on the summary, record summary page, on number 1 tab, you'll see there's the enter results. So you'll click this button and it'll bring up this message to say you're adding results to this section of your study record. And then it gives you the template option and checklist to make sure you've got everything. But if you're good, you can hit continue. And then it will bring you to this next page. So it'll kind of highlight what information needs to be put in and what the different sections look like. And so you can use those templates to kind of help you navigate these sections here. There's a really good resource on ClinicalTrials.gov, and it's a user's guide and tutorial combination. It's just like a one-stop shop for a lot of information. So I posted that as my favorite resource for this site. There are other websites that are good for this and helping you kind of navigate with resources, which is the ClinicalTrials.gov What's New. So there's any updates, changes in regulations or requirements, it'll be posted here. Or if you really want to, you can sign up for Hot Off the PRS, which is a newsletter, and they'll let you know what's changing and what's going on. They'll just send you a newsletter email. And then again, like I said, I'm always here to help navigate this. And sometimes it may take us a couple times, and then sometimes it just takes once or twice or once, and then we're good. So I'm here always to help, and I'm looking to try to put some more resources on OCRA's website in the future to kind of further help. And then this presentation will also be on our website for future resource needs. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have learned a couple things or found things useful, and we're ready for some question and answers.
Chrissy, let me jump in as real quick. We had a question on the side here about how long it takes to get a number, an NCT number. So I think it's important to sort of address that, and also the timeline for it. So when would you need that NCT number, et cetera? In my experience, that's needed upon publication. And so I allot enough time, just like an IRB submission. So when I submit the IRB, you expect to wait that requisite month or more. I would do that same thing with this system. And then I've not ever had a case where it didn't come in by the time I needed to publish a paper on it and use it for something. So that's been my user experience. But Chrissy, you might have a more formal administrative answer for that.
No, I mean, that's when you, and if there's any other detail that I can find out, I can always include that when we send out the slides. But I think that I'm in agreement with you on that part.
Yeah, and the other part is you may find yourself on occasion, or even right now, where you have a study that is ongoing that maybe should have been registered and you didn't. And so, what's the answer on, should you just go ahead and register it right now, even though it's more than 21 days past the first person enrolling? What is the timeline on that?
As soon as you figure it out, I would go ahead and register. They're forgiving in a sense. Things do happen, but it's strongly encouraged not to forget. But we're human and life happens, and there's a lot of different moving parts in a clinical trial. So just as soon as you remember, go ahead and register the study and get things started.
As a user, and so many other people may have the same type of a question, is having a proxy to help enter things. If you have a big lab, perhaps you've got a postdoc or a research assistant or something to enter these data for you. I've used doctoral students and others throughout the years. So perhaps, is there a way to set up a proxy, or do I just give them my login?
No, so that's a good question. They will need to, I can create an account for them, and you will just give them permission to have access to your study record where they'll be inputting information. And that's completely okay, but it's also good to remember that the ultimate responsibility for verifying the correct information lies with the PI.
Do they have any plans to fix the system so that it's not so clunky?
Well, I right before I came to FSU, I remember there was a survey. I think it was a nationwide survey just asking for feedback on the site. And I'm sure there was a lot of feedback. And so I do believe that they are looking to improve it and make it more user-friendly. The timeline for that, I do not know. But I know there is an interest, at least on that part, to make it a little bit easier to navigate. Thank you again for joining the presentation, and I look forward to working with everyone. If they need any assistance or need anything, you know where to find me.
Thank you, Chrissy.
And thank you again, Michael.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody.